Thank you so much for your promptness. It's very impressive. And welcome again to our evening's discussion of realistic hope, and to this now our second Danforth dialogue of the evening. Before we jump in, I ask you to re-silence your phones if needed, and remind you that you are warmly welcomed to a reception immediately following this event. It will take place in the Clark Fox Forum in Hillman Hall, just a short walk eastward from here, and there will be staff standing by to guide you as you exit the chapel's main door. Fanny Bialik, Assistant Professor of Religion and Politics at the Center, will introduce this, our second conversation. Her research and teaching focus on contemporary religious ethics and political theory, with an emphasis on feminist thought, Christian theology, and modern forms of power critique. Her forthcoming book, titled Love in Time, is due out from the University of Chicago Press in 2025. Please welcome to the stage Professor Fanny Bialik.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all so much for being here. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our next panel, turning from hope and imaginative possibility, the beauty of stories and language and poetry, to what might be the realistic part of the title of tonight's event, politics as it is now. I hope this isn't such a sharp turn. The conventional wisdom might be to campaign in poetry but govern in prose. But our next panelists have shown that where governance slips away from prosaic conventions and laws, the lines between prose and poetry, between adhering to norms and making them anew, must be redrawn. Jamelle Bouie is a leading political commentator and columnist whose incisive coverage of the Ferguson uprisings in 2014 as chief political correspondent for Slate made him a critical voice of a new generation's urgencies, agonies, and demands for change. He has been a columnist at the New York Times since 2019, where he has written on national issues including the rise of populism, waves of racist violence by both civilians and police, and in some of my own favorite pieces, movies. He's a frequent contributor to Slate's Political Gabfest podcast, and he's also an accomplished photographer whose Instagram is very much worth following as soon as you turn your phones back on. Congressman Adam Kinzinger served as a representative from Illinois' 11th and 16th districts between 2011 and 2023, with appointments to the Committees on Energy and Commerce and Foreign Affairs. A self-described conservative lawmaker, he broke with the majority of the Republican Party after January 6th, 2021, as he called first for a removal of President Trump on the grounds of the 25th Amendment, and then voted for Trump's second impeachment, and served as one of only 2 Republicans on the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol. He has since become a fierce critic of the Republican Party as the party of Donald Trump, calling it no longer conservative, including in his speech at the Democratic National Convention this past summer in support of Kamala Harris. As a veteran of the Air Force and current member of the Air National Guard, his service to the nation has taken many forms, and we're grateful to have both him and Jamelle Bouie with us tonight to consider this nation as it stands and as they hope it might. Please welcome Jamelle and Adam, Congressman Kinzinger.
Hi. Hey. Thank you.
Welcome, gentlemen. The wonderful thing about the last conversation was that we at times got up to about 30,000 feet, and it was beautiful to look at America and our current moment. This conversation is going to start at 3 feet. Congressman, what's happening in the presidential race right now?
Oh my goodness, crazy. First off, Senator Danforth, it's an honor to be in the room with you, so thank you. Like, truly in a league of his own for just America, for bipartisanship, for how we would love to see our governing get back to, and it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be with all of you. Look, I think this is going to sound like a cop-out, but this is literally where we're at. It's either going to be really close either way, or Kamala's going to win huge. The reason I say that, so if obviously the polling is what the polling is, it's a tight race. It should not be this tight, obviously, because I still to this day can't imagine how somebody could see all the lies and still go with Donald Trump and see what he did when he was governing. But I also think, and this is that little glint of hope that we should take into this, which is when somebody does polling, obviously they have to look and say, well, we need to assume, Republican turnout or Democratic turnout, and that's kind of the art form in polling. And I think a lot of pollsters are very nervous to put in Democratic enthusiasm into these polls because obviously they've been burned before by this. So when I say it actually could be a big Kamala win, and by the way, blowout, not like we remember blowouts 20 years ago, but in today's way we do that, there's a possibility they're undersampling Democratic enthusiasm. And you could see places like, she's not going to win Texas, but that's where I live now, much closer than people expected. Obviously all the swing states, but this is tight. And I'll just say real quick, for her to have basically assumed the nomination, just a few months ago, and to build this kind of coalition, fundraising, a strong amount of Republicans for Harris is very impressive. It is.
So your point on polling is essentially pollsters, if they're going to be wrong, they would rather be wrong and have Harris win than be wrong again about the level of the Trump support. So they're undercounting the Trump support because that's a mistake that they really think they would get penalized.
Yeah, that's my kind of gut sense, and I hope I'm right. That they're like, we can't give too much enthusiasm to the Democrats because, we got burned last time.
Jamelle, how do you see things?
I think it's worth. You said we're going to take this question at 3 feet. We can go up to 10 for a bit, and look at what actually is stable about this election. Yet again, for another election cycle, the presidency in a nation of 335 million people is going to be decided by, at the absolute most, 70, 80, 90,000 people across 3 or 4 states. Yet again, there's a real possibility that one of the candidates currently on the ticket may become president without assembling a majority coalition of Americans to vote for them. And although the national popular vote's just kind of trivia to some extent, it still confers some measure of legitimacy to those who win it. And yet again, once we end, however we get through this election cycle, there's going to be a decent chance of divided government. And in the modern era of divided government, that doesn't mean bipartisan cooperation all that much. What it means is gridlock and frustration, and the ways that gridlock and frustration, I think, ends up warping the larger political system. So for all of the things that are truly unique and unusual about this election cycle, we're still confronted with structural conditions in American politics that remain steady. And I would say we're producing bad outcomes, but they still very much exist.
So with all of that said, do you have a feeling or sense for how those 70 to 80,000 distributed across 7 states, how it might be going at this moment? And it's, as you know better than anyone, it's also perfectly fine to say, we got no idea.
Yeah, I'm very much inclined to say we have no idea. I mean, we could throw some chicken bones on the floor.
Sure.
And
and divine from
right,
them.
Right,
great
divine for them. We can go
yeah.
to I was just in Greece over the summer. We can go to Delphi. We can do the whole thing. But I honestly don't think that anyone outside of the campaigns has any real sense of what is actually happening. And even I think the campaigns at this point they are operating on, what all campaigns are like at this stage. You just have to hunker down and do the work, execute the plan such that you have it. Otherwise, I'm not sure there's any predictions to make, any things you could ascertain, because I'm with Adam, actually. I think the pollsters are very hesitant to have another misfire where they undercount Trump's support, and it seems safer to just assume an even race than it does to get too far out there. Lately, I've told myself that whenever I see an outlier, not that I think it's right, but I like it when the pollsters are putting out outliers, because that actually suggests something about maybe what's happening in the race. Or at the very least, it's a sign that the pollsters are confident about their methods, rather than what I think is actually happening, where everyone is saying, it's probably even, right, and we're just going to publish the ones that show that.
The so-called herd effect, where
right,
pollsters do what everybody else is doing because they don't want to be the guy standing out,
right,
out in the
Do you mind
field.
if I add something just real quick to that, too? I think there are two things that may be working in Kamala's favor a little bit. Number one, in 2016, people were embarrassed to admit they were voting for Donald Trump. And so that's part of the reason there was this undercounting. Among Republicans, the embarrassment is to say, I'm voting for Kamala Harris this time and not Donald Trump. I think there's a little bit of that. I think you're going to see more Republicans for Harris than we've seen in the past, for instance, Republicans for Biden. And I think the other kind of big issue is, I think that to me is the main one, is you may be undercounting that to an extent.
What's happening? Go ahead, jump in if you want.
I was just going to say, if I have to really, say something definitive and not just get abstract about it.
I'm going to drag you down to 3 feet.
Yeah,
Jamelle.
3 feet. I will say that if anything makes me think that Trump may lose, it's that it's very unusual for an American political figure to be in the public eye like Trump has for as long as he has, about 10 years. And that's just that doesn't happen. Even in the pre-television age, a president 8 years, and then they're kind of gone. They do their own thing for a bit. You'll forget that Herbert Hoover died in 1960. Herbert Hoover was alive for 30 years after he lost. I remember when I first found this out, I was like, "Excuse me."
But is that a difference between Herbert Hoover's sense of shame and Donald Trump's sense of shame? In other words, Hoover thinks, things didn't go so well, I gotta hide over at Stanford, whereas Trump
doesn't think that. But I think the extent to which he's really dominated American political culture for a decade is unusual, and I have a sense that people just might be a little tired of it. Yeah. Irrespective of how they feel about him, it's just sort of it's been a TV show for 10 seasons in. The writers were kind of getting lazy. And let's just move on to the next series.
Let's jump this shark on this episode.
Yeah.
What? How long do you think Jump the Shark is going to have cultural relevance? Because some of us came home to watch Happy Days when the shark jumped, but a lot of people didn't.
I was just thinking that Jump the Shark is a cultural reference that must be illegible to 30% of the population at this point.
Right. Tell me about the Republicans for Harris, or you mentioned it already a little bit, but are they getting bigger? If you were never Trump, what was the hesitation with Harris? You were in conversation with these people. Mm-hmm. Pundits have a lot of theories about, they don't know about her plans and so forth. I'm dubious about a lot of that. What are they actually saying as they get from, I don't like Donald Trump, but I'm not voting for Democrat, to I'm voting for this Democrat?
Yeah, and look, there are still a significant amount of Republicans that are either going to skip the presidential ballot line or write somebody in. And again, while I think you need to vote for one of the two, I also am willing to give some breathing room to some of those folks that just cannot vote for a Democrat, because it's at least we'll get that half of the win, right? Not voting for Trump. The problem is our political identity has become our identity. So we now see ourselves as, we make friends on the basis of, sometimes we take jobs on the basis of what our political identity is. So to leave that is really difficult. It's literally asking somebody to change their friend group, in essence. And so where is it right now? I've never seen, every politician has like a Republicans for this person or a Democrats for this person, but I've never seen anything as strong as this. And what I'm hearing from people is, first off, Kamala has not come across as, rabidly left-wing as some had tried to portray her as. They're now seeing, particularly with her DNC speech, she's pretty center of the road. This is 80% of Americans probably would agree with 90% of what she said. I think that's helpful. I think the Democrats, Donald Trump gave up so much real estate, American pride, being proud of your country. By the way, I'm going to tell you, Republicans are not proud of their country. They're proud of America as they envisioned it 30, 40 years ago, which didn't really exist that way. That's what they're proud of. But they say every day how much they hate the America that exists today. And so Kamala and the Democrats did a great job of seizing that ground. I mean, I'm standing there and people are chanting USA at me, right? It's great.
You mean at the Democratic Convention?
At the Democratic
where you
Convention,
spoke. Yeah.
Yep. And now that may not make a massive impact for November, but if I'm advising Democrats, I'm like, keep up on that, because over the next few years, you can retain that. So you're seeing a lot of that political realignment. There's just a lot of energy for her. And the people that actually do make the jump from I'm, writing somebody into I'm going to proactively vote for Kamala, I haven't, at least among my friend group, there's not a lot of guilt with it. They're kind of proud of doing it. It shows, to an extent, it shows how strong of a person you are that you're willing to take that stand. And, I think that...
Jamelle, what's your feeling about Harris and how she's doing with the traditional Democratic coalition, and then whether the Republicans, she's got a limited number of days, and how's she going to spend it? Does she spend it shoring up the Democratic coalition because she's got some weaknesses in there with labor, or is there a special kind of voter that she might have coming over that she should be appealing to, or probably both?
I think mentioning the short duration of her campaign, I think, is really important because it gets, I think, somewhat overshadowed in analysis of it. I think it's precisely because she's so seamlessly taken over. It feels like, yeah, of course she's been the nominee, but she took over, in late July, and so, August, September, she's at like 80 days or something as the nominee or de facto nominee. And so if you're going to break up her campaign into thirds, the first third of that campaign really was building out Democratic unity, right? Almost from the moment President Biden endorsed her to be his successor, you saw the fruits of trying to build Democratic unity. It's noteworthy that I think the first two major endorsements that came down were Bill and Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren, right? Representing, in a sense, like two of the major factions of the Democratic Party are saying Kamala's the one. And the choice of Tim Walz, beloved by the progressive side of the Democratic Party, all these things I think were aimed at shoring up Democratic unity, going into the convention with a united Democratic Party, a Democratic Party that isn't upset that there wasn't some contested convention or blitz primary or what have you. Phase two of the campaign was introducing herself to the broad public as this centrist, center-left, kind of, I wouldn't say Biden-esque figure, but a figure who is aimed directly at the middle of the mainstream of American life. And now in this final phase of the campaign, I think it is trying to grind it out on the margins. I'm not so sure that she is all that concerned with trying to cover weaknesses within the Democratic coalition. It's not at top of mind. It's clearly in the mix. She, yesterday or the day before, announced a plan to expand Medicare to cover elder care. Which is a big expansion of Medicare, clearly geared towards progressive Democrats, right? It's the kind of thing that a progressive Democrat would propose, and probably bought her some goodwill. But her attention, it was in the same kind of media blitz where she was like, also, I carry a gun.
Yes.
Which to me, that's the kind of thing that you say when you're trying to attract or focus on less attentive voters. And I think that's also an important thing to remember, that the people who are undecided at this point probably aren't undecided because they're like, oh, I like this, I like pepperoni, and I like cheese, and I can't decide, I like them equally. They're more than likely people who just are not paying attention whatsoever. They're not tuned in whatsoever. Right. And so the campaign, I think, at this point is deliberately trying to grab their attention and then transmit the message that they want those people to hear, and do that over and over again, which means maybe Republicans who are disenchanted with Trump, Haley voters, right? It's meaningful that in the last, 2 months of the Republican presidential primary, you still had Nikki Haley was out, but you still had Haley voters going to the polls to cast a ballot for Nikki Haley, which suggests that these are people who might be gettable. Some, maybe some disaffected Democrats, particularly younger men, but these are the groups I think the campaign is probably focused on, and will continue to just monomaniacally focus on those people in this closing stretch.
Which is why Harris has been appearing on media kind of narrowcasted to all of those groups.
Right, narrowcasted to people who, again, may not necessarily. I'll just say this. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and I was like, I'm not going to early vote this time. I'm going to go to the polls this time. And then I was like, what is it? It's what, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, when is it? And I was like, yeah, if me, professional political commentator, cannot immediately identify the day where I'm supposed to go vote, I'm sure that a lot of people don't even know that much, and that's who they're focused on.
That's right, and you mentioned pepperoni versus cheese. There's also the group that's like, I'm not sure I'm having pizza.
Right,
Exactly.
People
that might even, were you going to?
I was just going to say the advantage that the Harris campaign has in tight states is her ground game and early turnout attention to. I just did an event for her in Nevada. It was a labor-focused event, and I mean, it is kind of harrowing to hear some of these labor leaders talk about how their members are yelling at them because they're pushing Kamala and they're with Trump. I mean, that's a concern if you're a Democrat, is what's happening in labor on that end. But to go to their campaign headquarters and see, 40, 20-some, I was kind of jealous of them because I remember those days, how fun it was, working all night, working to get people to turn out. In a tie game, whoever has the turnout will always win. It may make only a half a point difference or a 1 point difference, because how many people on any given day are sick? So how many people on election day are sick, right? Whatever it is, 1%. Well, they're not going to vote. So making sure you bank all that early is essential, and she is absolutely crushing them in this.
Can I make one other observation just about the Trump campaign now, which is that if the Harris campaign's theory of how to close out the election is focusing entirely on people who are just not engaged but may vote, the Trump campaign's strategy at this point is to focus on people who might well like Trump quite a bit but don't ordinarily vote. And part of the question is, which of the two things is more difficult to do, right? It's a truism of political science that voting is a habit. People who vote tend to vote again. If you're the kind of person who votes in a presidential, in a midterm, and a local election, you are probably going to vote in every single election that comes your way. But the inverse is true, or the reverse is true, or opposite, however you want to put it. It's also true. If you don't vote, if you are habituated into not voting, then it's very difficult to get that person to go to the polls. And so part of what I think the campaigns are doing in these last few weeks, Trump campaign, can we get, these, I would say, the low trust voters, people who don't necessarily trust institutions, who are mistrustful of standard politics and like Trump, but don't go vote. And then the Harris campaign is, there are these people who do vote. Maybe they voted for Republicans, maybe they sat out an election, but they have a pattern of voting, but they haven't decided. So can we get them?
So just to give a little roadmap here, we're gonna get to hope, but first we're gonna have to go through what I like to call reality, and that's we're all gonna want hope when we get to the end of that. So, Congressman, at the end of the Democratic vice presidential debate, the Democratic vice presidential nominee said to the Republican vice presidential nominee, "Did Donald Trump lose the election?" Yeah. Take it from there.
Look, I mean, and this is a good time to point out, please, guys, beat Josh Hawley for me, okay? Can I just say that? This is... I just had this flash of him standing out there, on January 6th. And so, yeah, please.
Just to let everybody know. J.D. Vance was incapable of saying that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election.
He was totally incapable of saying it. And what you see from that is, look, if you put J.D. Vance on the CIA truth juice, right, he would tell you that Donald Trump lost. The thing that actually kind of worries me a little bit, and you and I were talking backstage a little about this, is I think the vast majority of people, or let's just say the majority of people that say the election was stolen don't really believe it. But to them, it's a tattoo of tribal identity. It's a tattoo of your politics. All that we can do is keep telling the truth. That was the big thing about the January 6th committee, is we were able to tell the real story of what happened. Nobody outside of the fringes believes it was the FBI or Antifa that did it. They know what that is. And so from my perspective, I really believe, and I mean this in all honesty, in 10 years, it'll be hard for you to find somebody that actually admits they ever supported Donald Trump. Because I believe that truth ultimately wins out. The problem is we're in this battle, right? Where lies are that identity thing. I mean, people think the hurricane was created by the government now, and they're out there saying that. And that is a big concern, because one of the things for the last however many years in politics, probably since the founding of this country, one of the things we knew is that we all had a common set of understanding, right? We all knew the government wasn't launching hurricanes. We all knew if you lost an election, you lost, and your way to come back is to run in the next election. That's what self-governance needs to survive. Just that basic understanding. You and I don't have to agree on a single issue, and we probably agree on more than we don't, but we don't have to agree on anything. But we have to agree about the rules of the game so that we can compete on that game. The second the St. Louis Cardinals get a single and run straight to third and say, well, we just wanted to skip first and second base, then everything falls apart. It's the same way with governance. And this is why, when it comes to saying the 2020 election was stolen, it really worries me, because a significant number of people believe their vote didn't count. And we know what the history of this country is. When we were taxed without representation, we launched a revolution, and we're proud of that. You convince a number of people, and J.D. Vance knows this. Donald Trump, I don't know if he even knows it or not. I don't know what's in his brain anymore. But the people pushing this lie know that the election wasn't stolen, and they're playing with fire. And the problem is, again, election cycle after election cycle, where this lie is repeated, I don't see self-governance surviving that. So all we can do, whether it's as journalists, as it's thought leaders, as it's citizens, is just tell the truth and just be committed to truth. Get frustrated when people are lying, but tell the truth repeatedly, because ultimately I do believe it wins out, but we're in a dark moment on that.
Jamelle, either build on that, or when you're working on your column, or, and this is very important, Jamelle has excellent TikTok videos, which I sometimes, when I watch them, I can see a sense of frustration is it difficult to keep having to say, or do you feel like, wait a minute, am I going to have to say again that this thing, or how do you wrestle with the fact that there's this gargantuan truth at the center of our political campaign that needs to be repeated every minute, but obviously as a columnist, you can't repeat it every minute?
That's a great question. I think part of my approach is to try to tie it to sort of larger themes and larger ideas of why it's important to tell the truth. The congressman got to some of this in your answer. So one thing that I keep coming back to, for example, is that we as citizens, as especially elected officials, we're not, the system's based on everyone pursuing kind of their own interests, but there's also a recognition that we have collective responsibility. Is it one of those collective responsibilities is just to the health of the entire political system? We are not the only Americans who exist or will ever exist. There will be Americans after us. And so it's incumbent upon us to pass on a political system to future generations of Americans that is workable and usable Maybe not perfect, but can be kludged into something that works. And the January 6th lie, the hurricane lies, the kind of flagrant lying, I would say, that has no particular justification other than, in the case of the stolen election lie, kind of like tribal identification, and for Donald Trump specifically, sort of like soothing his ego, right? Like he just cannot accept that he lost in some sense. Or the hurricane lies are just pure, narrow, for partisan gain. With no, I'm about to make a claim that might sound a little crazy to people. There's this thing, we talked about this on the GabFest this past week. There's honest graft, you've heard that term from 19th century urban politics. This idea that it's possible to be corrupt in a way that still serves the public interest. We're going to build this library, and if I get like a little kickback in the process of doing it, no harm, no foul, because the important thing is we built the library. I think to an extent, honesty works that way in politics. Sometimes you do have to be a little dishonest in order to do the public interest. The people who wrote the Constitution were definitely not honest about what they were doing. They were notably not honest about what they were doing, but they did that for the sake of trying to advance the public interest. You always have to have the public interest in mind. And what that is debatable, what that is contestable, but you have to articulate a case for and keep the public interest in mind. But the kind of aggressive lying for narrow, selfish, personal interests with no connection to the public interest whatsoever is really destructive. And the point I've been trying to make in writing about it or talking about it is that it's not just frustrating or unpleasant, but it's like actively corrosive to our ability to pass on a political system to another generation of Americans. And you already sort of see this among younger people. One of the things that I find quite disturbing is that we do have the youngest voters in this election cycle, the 18-year-olds, do not know a political world where Donald Trump isn't at the center of it. And what does that inculcate in them about how we do politics, about how we do public life, about how we engage with each other on the public stage? What it might do, I mean, for some young people, it may generate a kind of sense of revulsion, but for others, it might be a model. And so the cost of a decade of aggressive political lying and dishonesty might be a generation of a politics where we have to contend with the deliberate effort to undermine and corrode any kind of truthfulness in pursuit of political power.
Do you mind if
It attracts people who think not I want to reject January 6th. It thinks that looks like a party.
Right.
One of the things I learned right when I was elected is fear sells. I mean, fear sells viewers, fear gets you campaign donations, fear turns voters out. And what used to happen in the past is politicians would use fear a little bit, sometimes healthfully, whatever that word is, sometimes not, where it's like, okay, we need to be scared of, terrorism. We need to be scared of the Soviet Union. And so it's like a fire. It's like stoking a little fire. Sometimes you move that log, you let the fire grow a little bit, but if it starts to get out of control, and that's what responsible leaders, up till the advent of Donald Trump, have done. They know when things are they know that they have a broader commitment to the greater good, even if they're using people's fear. Well, when we started to learn in Congress, and that I can say specifically, that run against Washington, D.C., fear sells, scare, one of the things that radicalized the most people after the election, before January 6th, was not even Donald Trump's speeches. It was the 15 emails that people got every day, that fundraising with headlines like, they're stealing the election, Pelosi's coming for you, your family's in danger. You see 300-some messages, actually 600-some messages like that. And it's one of the things we couldn't explore much on the committee because we didn't have time, but that radicalized so many people. because we have used fear and we've let it get out of control. And that's what you're talking about. And that's where responsible leaders have got to come in and tamp that down. And it may make winning an election harder, but the long term of this is things burn out of control.
There's something called charismatic dissenters who are usually very powerful in these instances. In other words, a whole bunch of Democrats coming forward and saying what you're saying will be written off as just being against Donald Trump. But you are a charismatic dissenter, which is to say you are a dissenter within your own party where you pay a price. Everybody sees the price you pay. Liz Cheney is in that category. There are not enough of you to fit on an airport shuttle bus. So the story you just told, I'm all for it. How do you get more people on the bus, or maybe even get a second bus? Where are the incentives in that?
Well, I always thought, and I'm sure Senator Danforth will tell you, you always assumed that your colleagues had red lines that they would never cross. You always you play games a little bit. You have to, that's politics, but you always assumed people had a red line they would not cross. And I learned, obviously, over the last few years that just simply doesn't exist in many, particularly in my party. And I can't say anything about the Democrats because they haven't been tested like this because they've not allowed themselves to get in this position. I know my party has. And I think the way to get here specifically on the issue of truth-telling with regards to Trump and election lies, the only way I can give the best speech I've ever given in my life. You could have the best, most powerful show you've ever had. We could all go out and hold signs. The real key, to be honest with you, is Donald Trump has to lose. And I think once he loses, there is nothing that kind of sobers people up like a loss. I've said, I use the analogy, I felt like January 6th was like a massive bender, right, on Friday night. Everybody is just hammered, out of control. January 6th happened. My assumption was the next day, January 7th, would be like Saturday morning when you wake up and you're like, what did we do last night? I got this massive hangover. I should probably take a couple of Tylenol and drink water. But you can fix that hangover by drinking a Bloody Mary. Sometimes that's smart, actually. It helps. But if you start drinking again, the hangover goes away, but you're back in. And that's what happened, is they just started drinking again. And so I think it's going to have to be waking up one morning after this party and being like, we really messed things up. I think, and by the way, this is a long-term project. This is not a November 7th thing.
This talk of Bloody Marys, the advice to students portion was going to come at the end of the questions. Jamelle, do you buy that theory of the Republican Party repairing itself if there's well, let me just put it this way. What happens if Donald Trump loses?
I would like Donald Trump to lose for substantive and important reasons, but the historian in me just wants to see what happens, because it's really quite an unusual situation that we're in. It's not simply that Trump is the leader of the party, but the party's identity is tied up in his own ego, right? It's hard to see where does the Republican Party end and Donald Trump begins, or vice versa. So if he loses, one theory is that he doesn't actually go away, right? Maybe the legal cases don't require him he's not incarcerated, he's a free man, and so he just runs for the nomination again. He never relinquishes his hold on the party for as long as he's living. And I think that's a very plausible scenario, that it's not, Trump loses and then it's 2028 and Trump is the front runner for the Republican nomination. It wouldn't be the first time, right, that a losing candidate in American history ran for the nomination again and got it again. It's happened a couple times. Notable losers, William Jennings Bryan, Adlai Stevenson. It happens. So that's one possibility. The other is that all parties have these internal contradictions that under the right circumstances can actually pull them apart. And it might be that a Trump loss may be the thing that puts a lot of puts a lot of stress on the fracture within the Republican Party, which is between its growing blue-collar mass base and its still predominantly very wealthy, connected elite donor and political class. And Trump has been able to kind of like keep those two things together, but it's not a natural pairing, and Trump losing could cause it to begin to fracture. I would say even that Trump losing could begin to cause the Democratic coalition to fracture, because the Democratic coalition as well is built around beating Trump and contains parts that don't seem to go together all that well. But yeah, it's an interesting question. Before I turn back over to you, John, I do have to say that one thing about a post-Trump American political system is I do think that part of how Trump wins and everything, it's just a function of how we structure and do elections here, right? Like if it were possible, if it were somehow possible to go to the polls, and let's say we still have fusion voting in this country, and you could vote for, the main Republican ballot line was Donald Trump, and then there's maybe sort of like a Republicans for Democrats ballot line that you could vote for. So you don't have to vote for the Democrat, you can just vote for the Republicans for Democrats ballot line. And that ballot line goes to the Democrat. That kind of institutional arrangement might actually sort of like allow people to not feel forced to vote for the Republican. But just because of the way we do things, it forces a choice. You have to choose one or the other. And when you force a choice like that, people default to their partisan identities, they default to the well-worn grooves of their political lives. And it's really hard to get people not to do that.
Mitt Romney said he's not going to vote for Kamala Harris, even though he's not a supporter of Donald Trump's, because he still wants to play a role in the Republican Party. Does he have a realistic assessment of the future, of his future in the Republican Party?
No. And look, I love Mitt Romney. I do. I think he's great. He looks like he's like 52, and he's like actually just shy of 80. No, I mean, look, I understand how hard it is when you're a political leader. I mean, the governor of Ohio, who's made it very clear he's against Donald Trump, won't say he's voting for Kamala Harris because, he wants to still be invited to the cocktail parties. And trust me, the second you do that, go ahead.
Well, is it the cocktail parties, or are they worried about their physical safety?
I would say it's more the social cost, which is, look, I think people, more than they fear death, they fear being kicked out of their tribe. There's actually evolutionary, proof to that. I mean, anybody in here, I hope, would jump in front of a train to save a young kid that's going to get hit by the train. But not everybody is willing to lose all your friends, most of your family, and your identity. And so, look, I think there is some concern for physical safety. I experienced that. I've had death threats against my 2.5-year-old boy, by the way, to tell you what we're up against. And so I think there's some of that, but I think it's, the second I vote for Kamala Harris, then if the party has that, Saturday morning hangover, they're not going to let me talk to them because I voted for Kamala. I think he's inaccurate in this. I think if there ever is a day where people like him and I can go back and shape the future of the Republican Party, they're going to be actually throwing out all the Trumpers and running to the center and welcoming these folks back. I don't think that day is near. I really don't.
Jamelle, either build on that, or we're going to slightly sashay into the hope portion, even if it's a small corner of the room. Do you, Jamelle, there's that old John Dos Passos quote that, one generation treats history as a lifeline in a scary present. In other words, things that have happened in the past, it doesn't cause you to say, oh, it's all happened before, but it can sometimes make you think, we've endured this. What role does history play, since you spend so much time thinking about it, in your own sense of the durability of American institutions and the future for the one we've got right now?
It's hard not to be acutely aware, especially my personal obsession is just 19th century American politics, a very tumultuous decade, right, where the capstone event is this catastrophic civil war, right? And if American institutions can, in some sense, endure after that, I don't want to discount how catastrophic that war was, right? But if American institutions can endure in the wake of that, then I do have some confidence that they can endure through whatever this is. The one thing I'll say is, just with the Civil War on my mind, is that from the vantage point of today, we look back at the antebellum United States, and we know how the story ends, right? Like, we know what's coming. We look at the Missouri Compromise and we see, oh, that's just one building block in this road towards the war. But obviously for the people who experienced it, they didn't know that, right? They didn't know how any of this would go. And I think about this a lot when it comes to political figures, not necessarily the abolitionists who, they have the certitude of faith to drive them. But I think about the more ordinary politicians who in the 1830s and 1840s decide for themselves that we will do something about slavery through the political system. We cannot keep this from the national agenda. We have to do it through the political system. And so, guys like Joshua Giddings or Salmon Chase, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, all these guys. My personal kind of like political hero from the era, John Bingham. They are like workaday politicians who are, day by day, doing the best they can to represent the people who elected them, but also to make progress on this question of slavery. How can we restrict it? How can we end it? And the thing that I find so striking about this is that in the moment that they're doing it, they have no actual expectation that in their lives they will find any success, right? If it's 1840 or 1844 and you are an anti-slavery politician in Pennsylvania, the president's James K. Polk, first of all, like an avowed slaveholder. The country is about to take Mexico, or a large part of the Mexican territory, and expand slavery further westward. Slaveholders have the majority of the Supreme Court. Slaveholders have a majority in the Senate. Like, the United States political system is run by slaveholders for the sake of the interests of slaveholders. So if you're an anti-slavery politician in this moment, your expectation is that you may go to your grave not winning. And so it's like the thing, when I think about what the lesson history can provide for us, it's much less about particular circumstances. It's much more about the recognition that history is contingent. We don't know how the story ends, and the only thing we can do, not knowing that, is to work for a moment when the work we've put in, the things we've done, may help push the ball to where we want it to be. Because in the case of all these anti-slavery politicians, no, they don't know, but in 20 years, there is a secession crisis. There is we elected an anti-slavery president. There's the war, but also this anti-slavery president and his political party have this unparalleled opportunity to remake the country on the work that these men did in the years prior.
So is that faith in things unseen, whether that's God or just the system, or? It's
the faith in human action and the faith in contingency. Again, the faith in the fact that we don't know, and so the only thing we can do is like kind of exist in the now and do the things required of us in the now. And when I think about the challenges facing the American political system today, like I will write until my hands fall off about the need for like structural reform of the American political system. I don't really expect that to ever happen, but who knows? There might be a time in the near future, in the middle future, when I'm on my deathbed, when it's a live question, and hopefully people look back at this work I've done and use it as a resource for addressing that live question.
And, yes, applaud. And as you were saying that, Jamelle, there's a meaning meaningfulness in doing that work for its own sake in the moment that you're doing it, that sustains, that we'd all be so lucky to have a life where the work you're doing doesn't require, you hope it's going to turn out well, but it is meaningful in the moment, which leads me to a question about politicians. When I covered the Hill, people would run down members of Congress, and this was in the mid-'90s. This was impeachment. This is after Newt Gingrich. There were reasons to say things that were mean about members of Congress. There were so many members of Congress that nobody knew who went there to do good work. They had staffs that were in love with trying to get this thing through the process, The Dance of Legislation, which was a great book about building legislation in Congress that would seem like an act of, you wouldn't understand it now because of the way things are made. Explain, what would you say to somebody who said, I'm thinking about going into public service or thinking of running for the office? Can you still tell that story that there are, the majority of people in the Capitol are there to do good work? They may get it wrong, they may be, what's your feeling about the just basic baseline temperature? Not the hotheads, not the people we know, but the ones we don't see and don't know.
I think generally the people that go into politics go in for the right reason. By the way, we all have egos, okay? So there is that. That's a fact. Because if you don't have an ego, this is the wrong business for you, because you have to defend your good name, right? You have to put out a front and let people know who you are. But I think people generally go in for the right reason, generally. The problem is, of late, you can become really famous really quickly in politics. You know, it used to be you had to wait to get on CBS or NBC or ABC, so you were trying to do big things so that you get that one shot to be on the evening news, and that may kind of launch your name recognition. Now, all you have to do is tweet that the government can manipulate weather and maybe we should watch out for these hurricanes, and all of a sudden you're world famous, like that. And unfortunately, that's what we're, I think, putting into politics. So I take somebody like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Lauren Boebert, and say, they're obviously not in it for the right reason. Then I look at somebody like Brett Guthrie, a friend of mine I served with. Most of you probably don't know his name. He's been in Congress even longer than I was, and he's there for the right reason. I say that to caveat, he still defends Donald Trump because he has to. So I have to navigate with myself, like, how do I look at somebody and say they're doing it for the right reason, but yet they make these compromises to stay in that job? And that's a whole hour-long discussion in itself. But I will tell you, the people behind the politicians, the staff, still incredible. They are still, I mean, your government is literally run by 20-year-olds. And it's amazing. When I got there, I realized, like, yeah. I'm a puppet here. Like, my staff knows everything, and they're 20 years old. And but that, to me, is still an amazing American story. And the other good news is, I really believe, and maybe I'm skipping ahead on hope, I really believe that this kind of moment we're in repairs itself. Why do I believe that? Because it always has. And I think people are exhausted of what's going on. They're ready to heal the system. And the good thing is, this is a system that will once again attract good people to there. But there are people that are happy not to have their name known outside of their district, and there are people that are unhappy if you don't recognize them at the airport, so they'll tweet the craziest thing they can possibly think of.
Jamelle, two questions. We're going to lead into the students' question, but I want to, before we do that, I want to give you a chance to, you think a lot about reforming the political system. You already mentioned one, Republicans for Democrats or vice versa. Give us a little taste of your favorite reform at the moment that you're thinking about. Favorite's the wrong word. The one that you're thinking about, even if you think this can't work, but I'm obsessed with it at the moment.
I mean, the one that it's presidential election season. So the one is like ending the Electoral College, which my case for it's actually like a little different than most other people's. Like, generally speaking, our election should work that if you win the most votes, you should win the election. That's how it should go. That's like, I think, standard issue, how democracy should work. But I think people underestimate some of the more positive effects that it could have on our national politics. And I think they underestimate it because even when you say we should have a national popular vote, people still think in terms of states. They think, who's going to win California? Who's going to win New York? And they're like, well, those are all blue, and so those states will control everything. But you got to recognize at first, California is not all blue. There are more Donald Trump voters in California than there are in Texas, right? Like, there are more Trump voters in LA County than there are in the entire state of Oklahoma. And when you recognize that everywhere in the country, political communities are diverse, right? Like, deep red Mississippi goes 40 to 45 Democrat in most statewide elections. And so if the state borders no longer matter for the presidential election, if it doesn't really matter which state you win, then if you are a campaign, you'll all of a sudden have a new incentive to basically go hunting where the ducks are, wherever they might be. And so if you are a Democratic campaign, and then when you're thinking about what's the most efficient way to spend limited resources, if you're a Democratic campaign, the most efficient place to go hunt for votes might well be the Deep South, where every black Democrat you turn out in Louisiana and Mississippi and the Gulf Coast, it's a ballot for you. You don't got to worry about them maybe casting a ballot for the other side. And on the flip side, if you're a Republican, you might say to yourself, there are a lot of Republicans in upstate New York, which covers also the media markets in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire and this entire area. So let's put some money to get votes out in the Northeast. And I think a situation, or let's get votes out in Staten Island, for that matter. I think a situation where the political parties are saying to themselves, we have supporters in red states or we have supporters in blue states that we can mobilize and bring to the polls is good. Because I think it gets the parties thinking about their coalitions in broader ways and maybe gets them to invest in party infrastructure in places where they don't normally invest. And that might produce more competition in off-presidential years that would be good for the political system. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing that in Missouri, Republicans can kind of just win by default. That's like not good. It's not good. Separate and apart from my own, from your partisan, it's healthy for a political system for there to be meaningful competition. It's healthy for Virginia Democrats. I live in Virginia. It's healthy for Virginia Democrats that they're like, if we don't, play our best hand in a statewide race, we could lose. The state leans our way, but we could still lose. That paranoia is good. It's healthy for a political system. And I think getting rid of the Electoral College can help generate some of that. When all of a sudden it's like, oh, after this election's over, we will be in a world where the Harris campaign in this imaginary world has just put $30 million into getting out the vote in Montana. And that's a big boon to the Montana Democratic Party. And now we have to contend with what that means afterwards and vice versa. And that's kind of my case for it. Just like if we want a healthier political system, we have to have one where neither side, in a sense, can make a firm prediction about how the future is going to be. One of the great insights of James Madison, bracket that he was a slaveholder, but one of the great insights that James Madison had was this notion of the extended republic in Federalist 10, right? That like the thing that will make the American Republic work is its sheer size. Because of its size, no one faction can ever really assemble a true majority. And I think we can still apply that insight to our current political system and try to think of ways to kind of scramble coalitions and make them unpredictable.
Right, because we haven't talked at all about policy because of the political world we're in right now. But if you do that scrambling, sure, there'll be demagoguery, but there will also be arguably a flight to making the case. You have to put forward policy and people have to wrestle with them instead of now, which you've described so well, basically deciding what color is the shirt of this person, is it my team or not my team, and that tribal personal response, which swamps all policy considerations.
Or just the narrow casting, right? Like right. You also want parties to feel an incentive to assemble national majorities. I'll end with this. Richard Nixon, not a great guy, but there's something interesting to look back on at Nixon as a guy with this great ambition to build a national majority, a majority for the Republican Party. Where is that ambition in the modern Republican Party? Right. Not just to win, but to build a majority, to win decisively and convincingly.
And that was Karl Rove's dream, the permanent Republican majority, so big, encompassing so many people, the Democratic Party would just wither away and disappear. That does not exist anymore. Congressman, the question on reform. You've been in the inside. Get rid of money. What would you do?
Oh, that's a good question. Fix? So if I had a magic wand, I would absolutely eliminate the Electoral College because it just doesn't, and I'm going to go back to the simple explanation. It doesn't make sense that somebody should get more votes and lose. Now, I get it in the 1700s when, you didn't have, everything wasn't kind of as connected as it is now, but now it just makes sense. And people feel very disaffected. The other thing is, and this is going to sound interesting, but I think when McCain-Feingold happened, it was well-intentioned, but part of the problem is they took soft money out of the parties. So think about it. Soft money is like corporations can write a check, give it to the Republican Party. Now that may sound bad and may be corrupt, and I think it's like, yeah, I can understand that feeling. But what happened is the parties actually lost the ability to discipline their members. So parties had an incentive. Every party generally, like the amoeba party, kind of wants to be center right or center left because that's how you win elections. And so in those days, if somebody like Steve King came along or Josh Hawley came along, you could cut them off of the funds and be like, you can't lead an insurrection on January 6th. You're not going to get funded. Okay, well, I'll modify my behavior. Well, that was taken away from the parties. So the parties really don't have power anymore. I want to be very clear about that. They don't. And what that was replaced by was the thing that in hindsight made this all terrible was dark money. And the second the government said, basically the Supreme Court created oligarchs. And now it's not fair that if I had $5 billion or $100 billion or $50 million, that I should be able to write a check to put it, and we all have to use this now, by the way, because it exists in the law, so don't unilaterally disarm yourself. But it also is like, it's not right that somebody should be able to write a $100 million check and now determine what this election is about. That's an oligarchy. That's what we should be opposed to. But the problem is, that takes a constitutional amendment like the Electoral College.
Can I just say something? Because I strongly agree with this, and I feel like it's such an unpopular opinion, because what you're saying basically is that it's better if the super rich do cut a check to party leaders and they deal with it, because at least through that mechanism they're making considered decisions, but also there's a bit of democratic accountability built into that versus, some guy who runs the largest aluminum siding company on the East Coast and they can cut a check for $20 million to their pet maniac, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So the final question will be, we are an institution of higher learning. What, Congressman, should people be doing with their time in school? What should they be learning? Where should they find hope in the political system that's going to be a part of their lives? As I think Tim Walz has a great line when he's trying to convince young men to vote. He says, some of your friends may say that they're not into politics. He says, tough luck. Politics is into you. Yeah. So a little wisdom, and then I'll ask you, Jamelle.
I would say this. So first off, I really want to encourage particularly young people to get involved in politics, because if you're angry about what's going on, I'd actually love that anger, in the right way. I don't want you to necessarily be angry at it, but I would love that drive to compel you to go make a difference, to go make a change. I think that is very important. I think I would also say, look, chase whatever your dream is, even outside of politics, and look for the right opportunity if you want to run. Don't make your obsession in life being about running for office, because then you become a swamp creature. Make your obsession whatever it is, and then when you find that opportunity and that passion, jump. Be willing to lose, because if you're willing to lose an election, you go in and you say the right things that you're honest to. Be willing to lose your job, because if you lose your job doing the right thing, you can look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day. And that's what I would say. And to everybody, not just young people, we all are sitting here with the weight of the world on our shoulders. And the problem is the authoritarians, the soft fascists that we see now in our politics, they are energized by chaos. The things that make us tired, they love it, and they get energy from it. If we're tired and we disengage, or we just take a little time off, that's what they're hoping for. So that weight of the world that you carry on your shoulders, put it down, right? Vote, tweet if you want, talk to your friends, but you alone aren't going to change this, but you as a team can change it. And so take that burden you bear all by yourself and just give it to all your friends as well. You all hold this together. That's my advice.
My advice to students is much less high-minded. It's take advantage of the fact that it may not feel like it at the moment, but you have shocking amounts of free time. Sometimes I try to think about what I did with my time in college, and I can't, like, I did work, obviously, but that didn't take up that much time. Like, what did I do with all my time? You have so much free time, and you should use it to do whatever you want. You should use it to hang out with your friends. You should use it to pursue hobbies or interests. You should use it to pursue academic things that may not necessarily fit into what you're studying, but you're still interested in. You just have all this time, and you may not ever, at a point in your life again, have this much free time. And so just really savor it and take advantage of it, regardless of what you want to do with it. Now, the political thing I'll say is that I'm a very firm believer that Americans have gotten entirely too habituated to thinking about democracy in terms of going out to the polls and vote. I'm a very big believer that democracy is really like a set of habits. It's a way we kind of engage with each other. It's a process. It's a way of life in a lot of ways. And so try to cultivate democratic ways of living. Part of that is getting involved in not just things related to national politics, but student governance, getting involved in, local governance. I go to my city council meetings all the time. I was on the city parking commission for 2 years, just because I just wanted to be involved. And those sorts of things are places where you can encounter people that you don't normally encounter, where you can engage in deliberation with people that you don't normally deliberate with. And that's the kind of practice for just like being a good citizen. Because I think part of the thing that makes democracy special as a system is that it rests on kind of a presumption of equality amongst all of us. We all count the same, ideally. And we all should meet each other in the world as equals. And that's the thing you have to practice that. And so as much as you can, practice at it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks, Rick.